Well, okay, let's talk about American identity back in the colonial period and how that developing identity started causing conflicts with Big Mama Britain all the way across the pond. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So yeah, the fancy language to describe what we're talking about is the character of colonial society and culture. Sorry. Put my own self to sleep there. But I'm here to tell you it's much spicier than that. Really what we're talking about here is what makes an American an American. And the short answer, which I will presently Heimsplain, is diversity. And I know throwing that word around in certain circles is about as welcome as a fart in an elevator, but let me explain. You see, the 13 British colonies in America contained arguably the most diverse population in the world. And although the majority of the population were British, many other groups took up residence in these colonies as well. For example, German immigrants made up about 6% of the population, and in a lot of cases they left Germany on account of religious persecution and economic oppression. Many of them settled in Pennsylvania, and because they were Lutheran Christians, they added to the religious diversity of an already diverse colonial population. And then another group, the Scots-Irish, made up about 7% of the population, and many of these folks settled on the Appalachian frontier. Now, these happen to be lowland Scots who were forced into Ireland by Great Britain, and that's going to be important in the next period because they were emphatically not fans of England. Anyway, the Scots-Irish also brought with them their own Presbyterian flavor of Christianity, which only further diversified the population. And then another 5% of the population included other European immigrants, but we're not going to get too far into the weeds. And finally, about 20% of the population was made up of enslaved Africans, and as you may recall from previous videos, they were mainly concentrated in the South, and they migrated not because they wanted to, but because they were forced to. And then another 5% of the black population included free blacks, who were mostly concentrated in the upper South or various urban areas. But free just means that they weren't enslaved, not necessarily that they enjoyed equal rights with everyone else, because in most cases, they very much did not. Oh, and by the way, since we're here at the end of a unit, you probably got a test coming up, and you might want to check out my APUSH Heimler review guide, which has everything you need to study as fast as possible. It's got exclusive whole unit review videos that you're not going to see here on YouTube, note guides to follow along, practice multiple choice questions for each unit, full-length practice exams, and answer keys for every dang bit of it. So if that's the kind of help you need, then get that clicky finger out and check the link in the description. Anyway, all of that to say, the American colonies were home to a metric buttload of different kinds of people, and that very diversity in many ways became an important part of the American identity in the colonies. However, I'm not trying to imply that if you walked up to some New England British Puritans or some Pennsylvanian German Lutherans and asked, "What's an American?" that they would say, "To be an American is to be a diverse we." I mean, just look at us. We're a big old melting pot full of immigrants melded into a single identity as Americans. No, that's dumb, and nobody thought that way. In general, American identity was still very much group-based, and the answer might change depending on which group you were talking to. And to be clear, these colonists didn't really think of themselves as Americans, but rather British subjects who happened to be living in the geographical region of the Americas. And speaking of which, here's where I tell you that over the course of this time period, the American colonies were showing some signs of becoming more British-like. Or if you're sassy, you could say that the colonies were experiencing a gradual Anglicization. What I mean is, by the end of this period, colonial American society began to look a lot more like British society than ever. For example, a class of merchants in the New England and Middle colonies had become so rich that they began to resemble the English nobility in their customs and their dominance of the social hierarchy. Their counterparts in the South were a handful of elite planters that were wealthy enough to own many enslaved people and thus to dominate local politics. Additionally, increasing wealth in the colonies led to a consumer revolution, which led to an increased demand for British goods, especially among wealthier urban families. And this meant that social status was becoming less tied to birth and family history and more to financial success. And then as land grew scarce, more and more people at the bottom of the hierarchy became landless and poor. And from where I sniff, that smells pretty British to me. Additionally, by the end of this period, all the colonies shared the same basic government structure, which included a governor and a legislative body divided into two houses, which was the same structure of government in England. Now, to be clear, there were differences between Britain and the American colonies with respect to who appointed those governors and the members of the legislative bodies, but the structure was very British in nature, even if the more local forms of government were more American and representative in nature. But here's where I tell you that there were two movements that occurred in our period that really did contribute to the development of a more integrated identity throughout the regions of the colonies. And taken together, these movements both contributed to and further fostered the Anglicization that I just talked about. Now, the first movement that helped foster a more holistic identity was the Enlightenment. Now, by definition, the Enlightenment was a European intellectual movement that sought to apply the rigors of scientific and philosophical reasoning to society and politics. And part and parcel of this movement was the emphasis on rational thought and the rejection of authority structures that came from outside oneself, most notably religious authority. And thanks to a robust transatlantic print culture, the ideas of the Enlightenment crossed the Atlantic and and played a role in uniting the colonists as a truly unique people. For example, writers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote about ideas like natural rights and the social contract, both of which played a significant role in the creation of an American political philosophy. And we'll talk a lot more about those ideas in the next unit, so I'll just leave it there for now. And then the second movement that helped foster a more holistic identity was the Great Awakening, which occurred in the 1730s through the 1740s. Now, in order for this to make sense, you have to know that by the 1730s, religion had generally declined in many churches throughout the colonies. And if you want an example, and I know that you do, then let me tell you about the Halfway Covenant. You remember how all those New England Puritans were all, we're a city on a hill, we're gonna be God's beacon on earth? Yeah, they were pretty intense about their religion, and they only admitted people into the church who could give a credible testimony of their conversion. But after about a generation, apparently the younger folk weren't as interested in the religious strictures of their parents. And that meant that they very much could not meet the requirements for church membership, and so the churches began to get real sparse. And it was that situation that led to the Halfway Covenant, which allowed people to be baptized even if they hadn't been converted and thus became church members. Now, they were still barred from other ordinances like communion and voting on church issues, but, at least they were half Christians and could still be part of the church. Anyway, the point is, religion was on the decline, and that decline also had political causes as well. You see, after the Glorious Revolution in Great Britain, the New England colonies were forced to accept policies ensuring religious tolerance, which, for the Puritans was kind of a bummer. And that development only hastened the decline of their particular understanding of religion. But starting in the 1730s, colonial religion came roaring back to life in a massive revival that swept through all the colonies. It began in Massachusetts under the preaching of a congregational minister by the name of Jonathan Edwards. And if you've ever heard of him, it's probably because of his mildly titled sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And that might give you the impression that Edwards was one of those sweaty preachers who yelled at his parishioners until the pulpit was covered in flop sweat. But actually, in his preaching, he was pretty tame. And although his sermons were tightly reasoned and highly philosophical, people began responding with highly emotional outbursts, which would become a very big part of the American religious identity. And that's essentially what a religious revival was by Edwards' reckoning, an emotional response to the preached word of God, which resulted in the spontaneous conversions of large numbers of people. And that's what the Great Awakening was all about, reaching the masses. Anyway, a few years later, a British minister named George Whitefield came to America and preached a similar message, making prodigious use of his famous and soaring oratory. He traveled the continent preaching in churches and street corners and fields, and soon a religious fervor was lit in all the colonies. And so churches throughout the colonies began following suit, emphasizing personal, emotional, religious experience. I mean, let's be honest, could they even call themselves Christians if they weren't shouting or weeping or fervently chewing on a pew rail? No. The answer is no. Anyway, this growing emphasis on Christian emotionalism led to a debate about whether this kind of Christianity was the real thing or merely an aberration. On one side, you had the New Light clergy who believed that emotionalism and personal experience with God constituted the proper form of Christian experience. But on the other side were the Old Light preachers who were skeptical of these kinds of religious theatrics and pushed their people to a more reasonable religion. Which was great for them because, it takes some effort to get those teeth marks out of the pew rails. Regardless, the point is the Great Awakening spread rapidly and it became the first mass movement in the American colonies. And as such, it helped form an identity among Americans that helped them understand themselves as a unique people. And just to tie all the strands together, both the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening are movements that resulted from Anglicization in the colonies, but there's more than a little irony here. The Enlightenment, not to mention the Glorious Revolution, gave the colonists a sense of pride in being British subjects, while at the same time supplying them with the very ideas that they would later use to challenge Britain for the curtailment of their rights as British citizens. And then the revivalism of the Great Awakening actually began back in England under the leadership of folks like John Wesley. So this very British movement spread through the colonies, but at the same time, with its emphasis on personal religious experience over against the ordinances of the established Anglican hierarchy, it gave the colonists a real understanding of how to challenge traditional authority. But even so, American colonists often felt that they were not merely the colonial slaves of the British Empire, but something much more unique and independent. And because of that, tensions very much started occurring between Big Mama Britain and her colonies across the sea. And these disagreements basically fall into three big categories. First, colonists disagreed with Great Britain regarding territorial settlements in the Ohio River Valley. So on account of the incredible colonial population increase through natural reproduction and immigration, land became real scarce in the territories of the original colonial boundaries. And so many colonists desired to push west into the Ohio River Valley to create a better life for themselves. But Great Britain was all like, y'all so crazy. And that's because colonists' desire to migrate west created two problems for Britain. First, they wanted peace after so many bloody conflicts with the indigenous peoples who lived west of their colonial territory. And allowing colonists to claim further land would only reignite those hostilities. Second, they feared that by crowding French claims in the region that it would spark a conflict with them. And it very much did exactly that, but I'll save that juicy story for the next unit. Anyway, after considering these problems, the British went ahead and shut the idea for westward expansion all the way down. And that, not surprisingly, led colonists to get real grumpy about their lot in life. Okay, now the second category of disagreement was regarding colonial self-rule. Now remember from previous videos that because of the big honking ocean that separated the colonies from the imperial mainland, land, the colonists developed their own ways to rule themselves and had gotten kind of used to making a lot of their own decisions. And especially during periods of salutary neglect when Britain was distracted elsewhere with more pressing issues, the colonists could start to think that they were sort of, independent. But there were other times when the British government came back to remind the colonists, "I'm your mama, y'all do what I say." And one particularly egregious example of this was the practice of impressment for the British Navy. So long story short, Britain fought a series of 3 wars concerning disputed colonial borders. And because they were always short of men in the British Navy, the officers resorted to impressment to fill their ranks. And that basically means they forced colonial men to serve in the war effort on British ships. And everybody knew that living on a ship in the Navy meant that if the war didn't kill you, then the dysentery probably would, and that left those impressed colonists real angry. And during one of those wars, namely King George's War, the resentment got so hot that it boiled over into 3 days of rioting in Boston in 1747. And while there's lots of juicy stuff I could tell you about those impressment riots, there's really only one thing you need to stick into your brain folds. These riots indicated that colonists had developed a sense of their natural rights and refused to allow an imperial power to infringe on those rights. Like, technically speaking, the colonists were British subjects and Britain had every right to draft them into their wars. But the fact that the colonists were like, "Oh heck no," tells you that in their own minds they thought of themselves as perhaps more than British subjects. And then one more example of a conflict over self-rule during this period was the Zenger trial of 1735. So a guy named John Peter Zenger ran a colonial newspaper in New York, the goal of which was to inform the public about British infringements on colonial rights. And again, the existence of this paper was owing to the spread of the Enlightenment and the growth of print culture that helped to spread these ideas. And so when he published a piece criticizing the dismissal of an American judge by the corrupt British-appointed governor of New York, Zenger was hauled into court on charges of sedition and libel. And at that time, British libel laws didn't distinguish between truth and falsehood, only whether a published piece undermined government authority, which of course Zenger's piece very much did. But even though Zenger had clearly broken the law as it was written, the colonial jury acquitted him. And so this trial represents yet another piece of the growing resentment puzzle that was being put together in the colonies during this period. And finally, there were disagreements between colonists and Great Britain regarding trade. You see, since the colonists were multiplying like mad, that meant that they needed to import increasing amounts of British goods. But on the other side of the ocean, the British population wasn't really growing that much, so the demand for American goods had kind of reached its peak. But Americans were all kinds of industrious and had metric buttloads of goods to trade. However, if you'll recall, through the Navigation Acts, Britain had restricted colonial trade to Britain alone. And again, that ramped up the colonial resentment because they were forbidden to find other trading partners for their growing stocks of tradable goods. And so colonists found ways to smuggle goods to buyers other than Great Britain, a move which bolstered their economy greatly. But again, in time, the British would come back and try to shut down all this smuggling, and that would lead to yet more resentment, and I bet that's going to have some consequences in the next unit. Okay, if you need help studying, then click here to grab my APUSH Heimler review guide, or you can click here to watch my other Unit 2 videos. I appreciate you coming around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.